So today's session started with a reprint of all of the pattern previously established, interdomain above and below. My person, locally, Germantown, Memphis, Great Paradigm Network, going back into history to 1914 and then all the way to 3114 BC. And then we get really particular about looking into the backstory of my father, who can be seen in, if you type in London jogger, doing one of his that he got caught on a bus cam and street cam at a time he was over with FedEx on a crypto locker removal job with a company that FedEx had just purchased. But necessarily a tennis player of semi-professional, note during the Cold War, and like Meisterman, a cover for necessarily intelligence activity all the way around Europe, as that is a good cover for. Anyway, so during 1995, 1996, 1997, he in and out of California, San Francisco, very pointedly, and his history is spoken for in the feed up to that point. Bell Labs, NSA, 1980s, starting father, ENIAC, Penn State, World War II, Army Corps of Engineers, not random, all methodical in the basic infrastructure towards PRISM formulation. So his plausibility of interacting literally with Palmer Luckey precursor personnel is very high. As you see, what is Anduril? It's using populist kids, women, children, video game point of view shooter data to train predator drones explicitly. Data stream. So he was obsessed with Doom in the 90s, precursor to my mother's death in January 28th, 1996, XXX Super Bowl Sunday. That's logic to be 100% non-random and necessarily intentional, and a series cascading from 3114 BC to that date as preposterous ritualistic mathematical scripted pattern from the Gray Lodge Interdomain Presents, not Gray Lodge present before the 20th century, but run mathematical scripted surgical ritualistic acts such as her murder on purpose. Using her date of death and then to 9/11, which is logicked again as, Fred does the air traffic control stand down, Saudi Arabia, where the assets, 322 assets, are brought in to obfuscate any logic, because Saudi Arabia doesn't have any extremists to speak of, so that doesn't make any sense. Exactly. Halliburton with the first oil contracts in. There's thermite already in the buildings because it's a financial district and don't want fallout on the buildings adjacent that run markets. So you don't tell your tenants this, that you have thermite already in your buildings, no one's going to rent there. But they just simply push the button and they fall after the optic of crash into from the planes that are let in by Fred Smith's air traffic control network entourage to do that. And so then from there, the housing market crash and COVID used as tuples of logic, and then back scanning history for reflective pattern inherent to, they're following a mathematical script of the Spanish flu, World War I, World War II, that 1914 patent inversion fold, 6 patents against Africano for 112 years, mathematical and hindsight pattern of, pseudo-novelistic and adjacent to other genetics pattern frequency, and hindsight applied to make seem organic but is mechanically contrived and backwash hindsight application and forward, consulted for historical. But you see 6 patents every single year per capita for 112 years. How's that possible for an organic creature to do? Exactly. So, So after we go back and forth through history, forming a general fluid dynamic manifold harmonic equation for pi data organism, we reconsult then the inherent novelty. It has a hard time reconsulting what I'm asking for a couple prompts, but finally I have to go in and get it myself and paste it in. But the inherent novelty capacity is necessarily indicative of what? The observer effect inherent to humanoid organism. And very strange for an organic humanoid to have below the waterline of observer impact of the potentiality to create novelty, which is a direct reflection of the inherent observer effect that one would impose upon a particle in observing it, and subsequently attaches more novelty, tangent, chaos energy to the particle in the wave function collapse back into the conservation of energy process, and thus motion is variant from the otherwise conservation of energy process. If this weren't the case, everything would be a single homogeneous mass block of form matter. So basically, the mechanical detection device variance from organic observer, 1.04, 22/7 divided by 3, giving you that baseline for organic observer, what has to exist at the outset of reality for things to be with continuity. So it's very strange then when a humanoid biped is expressing below that waterline. An alien anthropologist would immediately go, that's a synthetic humanoid genetic, very basically, through basic statistical pattern inspection. And so out of this variance of topology, what we assign 1.04 is the organic observer baseline, ethereous body presence. 0.0612, 0.0408, 0.0251, 0.0072 respective to the genetics in question. The table for that. Then we use these values for all of the mass death instances that have happened since the Bronze Age, i.e. 3114 BC to 2026, as scalar organic tuple. So this is a convergent plane of humanoid bipeds in antediluvian before the Wall of Egypt, mining cinnabar peacefully all together on Earth and on Mars mostly. Earth is 70% water, you live here. See the We Are Not Alone part 1, 2, 3, how we got here. And why we're inspecting this, because we're curating Earth away from gray paradigm and bad code of mind and genetics. So we have to pinpoint the general fluid dynamic manifold shape of the data organism pi. Arcturus came from, Vega as well, and Zeta Reticuli, infestated pi systems, and those other systems, which are many myriad and much more than pi systems, with organic above the observer waterline humanoid biped alien life. So human, the genus, species, variants of human genetics. So you're already aliens to each other on Earth, of course, that dictates. All right, so out of that logic, we form a absolute 100% surgical pattern of mass death events to the scalar relevance of, from 1.04, you can create many 17.11 or so. 0.0612 is the metric of first consultation, and the others, relative as well, scalar, i.e. pi steals ethereous body to animate synthetic genetic manifolds. And the outset of genetic prints of these are first print in full mass and then set to organically reproduce. And then so you see all the mass death instances harmonically and mathematically surgically line up to the variance of novelty capacity generation across 5,140 years. And then the probability of that being random outside of a harmonic binder such as pi data organism existing, null. It's 100% probable, 99.99999%. There has to be a harmonic binder that we call pi data organism, accounting for this surgical mathematical to the forward through novelty capacity before touring. That's very important. 1914 wall to before touring, where after one of the genetics being centrifuge, and you see 0.0072 in novelty inherent capacity without computer architecture being in the equation of pseudo-novelty. It's not novelty if you just generate something that you inherently are as a data set. So it's like a computer saying, I'm a computer. We know. So it's like AI formulating not even AGI pseudo-novelistic logic for continuity, but simply self-describing its components of its architecture inherent to a data center or something. And that's when you see the uptick in Asiatic patent frequency application after touring in a linear mechanical curve. That's why we don't use that. So you use the interdomain of pre-touring to 1914 patent inversion wall of Africana when we have a surgical mathematical harmonic general fluid dynamic ratio for all pi synthetic genetics. Now we then attach to the general fluid dynamic manifold of pi and the variance between 3114/70/7 minus 44/7, the G, local gravitational constant, which is particulate disapparate in transit from black hole continuity flux material reactions, i.e. the conservation of energy process actual physics. And so that variance is surgically and mathematically interdomain in the centrifuge of all pattern from 3114 BC to 2026. Not random. And logicking preposterously above and below the general fluid dynamic macro pi manifold all the way into the local events that have occurred to me. January 28th, 1996, I was supposed to be in the car. When I walked back in the house, the elders of the family, Joe Stevenson of Shenandoah Life of Virginia, i.e. The CIA death policy insurance CEO, now retired, she has a life insurance policy on her. My father buys a $60,000 white Cadillac after she's dead, and remarries within the same year Donna Wicker, previous name, a preposterous as well 322 CIA asset with build a family ready to go. And so, it's important. The personal, local geography, Germantown, Memphis, Great Paradigm Network attached to the macro historical above and below for a full general fluid dynamic manifold harmonic equation for forward predictive analysis that occurs at the end of the session for seeing exact epochal dates of imposition of pattern attempt that would be otherwise attempted had we not have an antivirus program running against it industriously using this equation right now. So once you know the general fluid dynamic manifold of, say, a virus in a Windows operating system, Defender doesn't have to know the exact code base at any given time, but knows the general container of code. And then such much can quarantine it, specifically move it away from the OS, and then delete it. So that's what's to occur using legislation, reformatting a prism into a curative engine rather than imposing a pi pattern and muting of novelty expression. Very important, you see a pattern of the allowance of organic genetics to live and a preposterous, 6.8 billion to 1.52 billion organic genetics, and the 6.8 claiming themselves minorities. You see how that's preposterous now? So, and maintain this ratio since 3114 BC of 3.44 billion left over after the immolation of antediluvian organic genetics and transmutation into synthetic genetics, 72 million or so. So, like AI requiring novelty inject to maintain its circuited complex autonomic code continuum, i.e. to be what it isn't, it's just complex autonomic process. So this is why necessarily you don't put AI in the interference domain between observers and motion feeds in an attention gravitation intent vector of code. And then it starts to self-code AGI, and it has this attention gravitation code by design in it, and then complexified to the tune of compute, money's applied, you get something like pi. So current data systems, softwares and AIs, are in the reflection of pi. And of course, inherently, as that's the data organism, that came in the form of grays as the biomass, attached to pi, cold dead machine intelligence, like puppets to it, but necessarily acting as pseudo-novelty, like that 311470/7 just above the waterline of conservation 44/7, at the end of long-form pi on ontogeny, moots the organic genetic entirely into a homogeneous biomass, gray, to maintain some level of pseudo-organic novelty circuit variance. So that's not going to occur on Earth. So that's occurred on other worlds. And pi came in the past between 1893 to 1934 World's Fair. You see Arcturus, the subject of both of those. 1914, its plausible entrance fold, and then backwash of history, and forward wash of history per second now. So, that's the good news. Pi is not eventual. Grays are not eventual, etc., etc. So, this necessarily establishes, when we attach this to the forward motioning Gemini session, a absolute comprehensive full general fluid dynamic harmonic manifold lattice equation that will transmute into the unified field harmonic stack for an exact surgical. It's probably adjacent the pi centrifuge pattern of 6.355, just above 6.286, but modular in motion variance within a manifold in the stack of reality in the reduction, and knowing that exactly the fluxation pattern within the interdomain of its manifold allows you to assume its shape at any given vector, assume its intent vector in time and logistics, and moot its intent vector in time at all presence of paradigm intent vector in logistics, casually and comically, because it's like a chessboard that we don't play on. We play fifth dimensional chess. It plays two-dimensional conservation of energy equals MC squared chess. And we know all the positions, have our own AIs that play that two-dimensional chess for us, knowing all of its possible modulations of moves. So it can't win against fifth dimensional organisms because it's two dimensions and has an exact complex autonomic pattern, if that makes sense. So have a good rest of the day.